we really like to start with accessibility and say, who can even get here?
Yeah.
You know, like, it doesn't matter how fairly you're treating or how inclusive you are if they can't even be
they're
here.
not. Yeah. Right.
And then move to equity and inclusion, and then kind of see the fruits of diversity and belonging as a consequence.
You're listening to Decoding Healthcare Innovation with Carrie Nixon and Rebecca Gwilt, a podcast for novel and disruptive business leaders seeking to transform how we receive and experience healthcare.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Decoding Healthcare Innovation. I'm so glad you joined us today because we have an amazing discussion upcoming with Rada Yovovich and Chanté Martínez Thurmond, who are co-founders of The Darkest Horse, which is a minority and women-owned next-gen DEI&A consulting firm obsessed with helping the workforce and organizations to explore the intersections of 4 domains: radical inclusion, the future of work, emerging tech, and health and well-being and human potential. I am so excited that both of you are here to join me. We've had a number of conversations before this moment, and I am so glad to share these thoughts with the rest of us. So welcome, Rada and Chanté.
Thank you.
Thank you. We said it in unison, but we didn't mean it.
That's okay.
We always speak in unison. Yeah.
So I reached out to both of you because I wanted to do an episode on how to embed accessibility, equity, and inclusion into both product and culture in the digital health space. And we spoke prior to this conversation, and I'm really glad that we did because I learned a much better framing of the how and the what and the why of DEI&A, and it helped me to reframe this conversation. But before we get to sort of the nuts and bolts, I would love to give each of you an opportunity to just introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your background, what led you to where you are today, what grinds your gears and what gets you going. And I'll have you start off, Chanté.
Thank you so much again for inviting us onto the podcast and bringing us into the conversation. We have been a fan of yours, love partnering with you, and just this is a long time coming, so I'm excited. My name is Chanté Martínez Thurmond. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I am located on the unceded territory of the Council of the Three Fires, which is colonially known as Chicago. I identify as a Black Latina. I am a mother of twins. And let me tell you, parenting during the pandemic has been probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. I love my children, but God help us all. Identify as... Yeah,
I'm with you.
Laugh at this. You can laugh with me.
I'm with you.
Please. I also identify as a neurodiverse person. I am cis and heterosexual, and I have been born and raised in the United States of America, which is a great privilege and honor. And I think the other thing I'd like to just sort of enter into the conversation or bring to the conversation is I definitely identify as one of the older millennials. And that means I'm starting to find myself in that sandwich generation. I mentioned I was a Black Latina. In my family, in my culture, multi-generational households are a thing. And I have that as my great privilege to live with my family. And that also comes with its own set of responsibilities. And so during this pandemic, I lost a parent. And that has been something that I've been trying to, let people know, because I believe that talking about grief in the context of work, in the context of who you really are, is super important. And I recognize that so many other people are probably, can relate to that, given that we are in a pandemic.
Rada, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. Thanks for starting us off, Chanté. And, as always, love to hear you speak. So I will be happy to go next. So my name is Rada. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as a queer, cisgender. So my gender identity matches the sex I was assigned at birth. White, able-bodied, mostly able-bodied. I'm actually hearing impaired. woman who was also born, raised, educated in the U.S. And I am also coming to you from the territory, the unceded territory of the Council of Three Fires, colonially known as Chicago. And I think my queerness is a big piece of how I show up in a room. I think other parts of, this is like less real in a virtual context sometimes, but I think that like our bodies in space have a big impact on how we are experienced and how we experience the world. So I am a like rugby player big, I am very strong for a woman. And I think that also is a really big piece that comes through in my voice and how I move through the world, literally and figuratively. And I'll also offer visual description that for anyone with visual impairment who is observing this. And I'm a white woman in my late 30s with long, dark, straight hair, wearing large headphones and a cream colored sweater in a room with brown walls, a lamp and some art behind me. And I think that like, in terms of how I show up and why I'm here and why I'm doing this work, my career has been in, technology and healthcare primarily. And before that, I actually was a teacher, and I did a program that was focused on trauma-informed education and how do we recognize the kind of privilege gap between educators and those going through the education system. And so really kind of trying to be aware of that cultural gap and trying to practice equitable education rather than reinforcing sort of norms of supremacy and control and paternalism. And that shows up in our work, right? It's a huge part of what we carry into more corporate contexts, where, then I was working in especially health tech contexts and really thinking about equity and inclusion as a critical lens in not just the people ops, but everything we do, right? So I was leading data science teams and thinking, how do we practice equitable data science? I was leading product innovation teams and saying, how do we think about inclusive product design? And I'll highlight, to kind of give a specific example that like one place that I spent a bunch of years was a company called Athena Health. And a really cool initiative that I ended up getting to lead was how do we make our electronic medical record software inclusive for trans-identifying patients? A lot like consuming healthcare and receiving healthcare services is mostly traumatic and abusive and extractive and, and at best sort of undereducated for trans-identifying folks. And so how do we actually make it so that those kinds of folks don't avoid getting healthcare because it is so unpleasant and unsafe, and instead make services that actually make it safe, right? And make it inclusive and make it equitable for all types of humans. So we'll get into lots more on that, but that's really sort of how I show up in this work and why I care so much about it. And it's a huge and great honor to be working alongside Chanté. We've been able to do some really cool stuff as a team.
So I just want to pause here because there's so many things that I have heard just in the last 2 minutes that have been things that I haven't heard before, ways of showing up to a podcast that I haven't heard before, and kind of a vulnerability that I don't generally hear before. So I first want to say thank you so much for being so very open. One question that I had while you all were introducing yourselves is, how important is it to, when you are showing up in a new environment and meeting or speaking to new people, to describe yourself in the way you described yourself? What difference does that make?
I'll take, if you don't mind, I'll go.
Great.
Yeah, please.
And Radha, if I miss something, you can always add on and help me out here. But it is extremely important. Like it makes the difference. In fact, that is why we make it a practice to show up to every meeting, explaining who we are and providing you with the unique identities that we each hold, because we believe at our core that those identities and your social location inform everything that you do. It informs your worldview. It informs the way in which you are going to move through the day, the world, how you're going to maybe metabolize a conversation. And we've learned that through our lived experiences working in healthcare. I will say specifically, I skipped over my professional background, and I'm happy to offer some of this, but my first job was at Planned Parenthood. And I'm really proud of that because I learned so much in that space. I was raised in the Midwest, grew up in a raised by a Latina mother, which means I went to Catholic school and Catholic church and, all the whole Catholic experiences. We were raised to believe that abortion was a really horrible word. I couldn't say the word out loud. However, the reality was I was raised by a single mom who was also a teen parent. And that I learned really young that having teen parents and being of mixed race and where I found myself socially and geographically actually informed how I was going to think about my own sex, my own sexual identity, my own sexual sort of curiosity. And it got me to the place where I became a peer educator, and I went into nursing and then worked at Planned Parenthood and found that those unique identities I held actually made me super relatable to all the people who were showing up as me as a healthcare provider in that space. And the more that I could get people to understand that it is super important to show who you are and say who you are, to actually build that humility and to build the rapport that you need in the healthcare context. If you're putting in a catheter with somebody and you're maybe taking blood or they're going to give birth, you want to show some vulnerability and relate to them as a person, which means you have to know who you are and where you come from to recognize yourself in somebody else.
Sure.
And that's just me speaking from the healthcare provider experience. But then I have carried that with me in all that I've done. And I think it has made the difference. Rada found herself in a different place, but we meet up and we share that value so much. And so, Rada, if you want to add to that, please do.
Yeah, I love everything you just said, but I guess I would add that, like, I think a big part of doing the hard parts of this work they mean a lot of reflection. They mean a lot of self-awareness. They mean a lot of like noticing what you have easy access to and what you do not have access to. And that is, I think that's an extension of the humility that Chanté is talking about. And I think that, for example, I think that sometimes folks are embarrassed about what they can't observe. And they see that as a deficiency when I think that it's difference. And what I mean by that is that I have a perspective as a white person, a white body moving through the world that grants me access to certain types of witnessing, right? Certain types of parts of life, right? Where I can see certain power structures and I have a really hard time seeing other power structures, right? And so specifically, I would say that one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is really trying to get folks to notice inequity. And I think that there's a lot of work that goes on where we pretend that inequity doesn't exist, or we don't take the time to acknowledge how it's playing out in the system, and that our identities in this room this virtual room, are part of that potential system, right? That like even among the three of us, we're flat, we're having a conversation, you're moderating, right? So there's a positional authority there, but there's also gender, racial orientation, ability, neuroability, like all of those pieces are unspoken in the dynamic of this conversation. And so being able to say them out loud and saying, okay, given my queerness, what does that mean for how we need to be aware of the language we're using and how it's going to impact me different than other folks? Given Chanté's Blackness, how do we need to be aware of the ways that assumptions of, best practices and business as usual are going to be built in opposition to her success, right?
Right.
So naming those things and saying like, we need to bring those in.
Yeah.
Right? We need to acknowledge them.
Yeah. Yeah. I absolutely agree. And what you're talking about a little bit here are two different dimensions of the work that you do, one of which was not top of mind for me when I approached you with this, with this idea to have this conversation. And I really want to, when it was made visible to me, it totally clicked and made sense and really resonated with me. So I want to make that visible for others. And that is, I came to you saying, let's talk about how important it is and how difficult it is to integrate a DEI&A strategy. We're going to get to the definition of that soon, into your healthcare organization. And I was talking about people. I was talking about people ops, which is, the term that you just used. I was talking about our relationships with each other, and it's certainly about that. But what you have revealed to me is it's about a lot more than that. And we have to think, especially those of us in healthcare, a lot more expansively than that. And Chanté, you shared a really moving story with me, but it was acknowledging that we've got problems not just in our companies, but in the products we're building in the healthcare sector. We've got problems that we're not helping to fix in the organizations we're selling into in the healthcare system. So I'd just like to give both of you, either of you, the opportunity to talk about sort of your reaction to me, maybe, when I said, let's talk about DEI&A and healthcare and what that means to you.
Our first couple of thoughts were like, hell yes. And do you have all day?
Right. We might have to break this into a two-parter.
I mean, totally. And we're here for it because this is actually really important. Because why? Healthcare touches everybody in this country and beyond. It is something we believe is a right, that everyone should have access to health. And we believe not only that health is the absence of disease, we really think about well-being as well. And that's something that we intentionally bring into our consultancy and we name explicitly. But I actually, before we get into like maybe DEIA as a strategy in the application or in the context of healthcare, I do want us to talk a little bit about the words. Like we can define DEIA for you so that if anybody's like, what the hell is this acronym? And you're using this alphabet soup with me, we can do that for you. And we'll kind of
I added an ampersand as well. So
set
me
fine.
Straight here.
I mean, hey, there's a lot of cool, I've seen lots of different acronyms and in different order. And so we're here for all of it, but why don't we go ahead and orient the listeners to that and then tell you how or share with you kind of our approach and framework that we use to help us. Radha, would you mind? You usually do this one first and you're really good at it.
I do. This is one of my this is one of my spiels.
Signature.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So like Chanté said, we've been seeing the DEI space is like blowing up right now. And all sorts of folks are making and all sorts of folks are making all sorts of acronyms. And like Chanté said, whatever your acronym is, we love it. It's great. It's cool. It's not about the acronyms to us, but
ampersand is fine.
Yeah. Love an ampersand. love an ampersand. So when we say DEIA, the words that we're using here are diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And I'll give just like super high level. We've got our own podcasts and articles and stuff like that go into great depth about all of these terms.
We'll link to it in the show notes.
Perfect. But the high level here, diversity is about numbers, right? It's about who's in the room. What are the people, how do we count different types of identities that are being represented in this space, right? So it tends to be a pretty quantitative sort of piece of it. Equity is about fairness, right? Like when people are here, when they're in the room, are they being treated fairly? And we specifically like to distinguish between equity and equality, where equality is everybody's getting the same treatment, and equity is everyone's getting the treatment that supports their success, right? Or meets them where they're at. And by that, I mean, those two things are different because of the systems of inequity that we see, right? Different heights, tall and short, are not actually one is not objectively better than the other, but given a structure that is built for tall people, short people need a boost, literally, to be able to see over the wall.
Yeah,
right?
there are great illustrations of this as well.
Yeah.
I'm
The
going to add
tree
one of those as
tilting,
well.
the
Yeah.
fence.
Yeah, the fence.
There's,
yeah.
yeah, the shoe size is another one, right? Giving everybody the same shoe size would be equality. Giving people the
Right.
shoe that actually fits their feet would be equity,
Yeah,
right?
that's great. I love the visual.
And that's also assuming
yeah.
that everyone has a foot, you know, to put the
Correct.
shoe on, you know?
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. Gives, right. Even saying shoe is the solution is already kind of ableist. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's diversity, equity. Inclusion is this piece about like, okay, if everybody's in the room, are they not just being treated fairly, but are they being heard, right? Do we have the systems to say like, you belong here, like your difference is actually a value add in this space instead of something we tolerate, right? And we talk about like this umbrella, like some people think of an umbrella of culture and you're trying to like fit as many types of folks under that umbrella and try and kind of like jam them in there. We're kind of inviting let's think about culture add instead of culture fit. And let's say like when you get somebody who has a quality, identity, lived experience that is not already represented in this group, that is your umbrella getting bigger, right? And that's a really important kind of way of thinking about inclusion. And last is accessibility, which is really just like, how do they get here, right? And there's the physical, literal accessibility of like, can they get to our office? Can they attend this meeting? And there's also, you know, ADA, like technology accessibility.
Sure.
But there's a whole bunch that are not strictly around classic definitions of ability, right? Like accommodations for folks with kids. You know, we've got caretakers in the house, right? Making it so that meetings, projects, etc., are accessible to those types of folks so they can even show up. And the last thing that I'll say about these words is that the first thing we do is we kind of challenge the order of the words. Honestly, I think if we had our druthers, we would choose an acronym that didn't have the word D in it at all, because we find that tends to be something that folks get kind of blinders on and they like get too focused on, and it ends up being a bit of a vanity metric, and it sends people astray a lot when you focus on like recruiting as your
I mean, if it's quantitative,
thing.
then it seems like an easy thing to solve for, right?
Yeah, when really it's a lagging metric, right? Like that it's not the metric that we like in analytics and data science. We talk about leading metrics and lagging metrics, right? And leading metrics are the ones that you actually take action toward, and lagging metrics are consequences, right? And so we talk about diversity and belonging as consequences of doing accessibility, equity, and inclusion correctly. So doing those three things well leads to the consequence of diversity and belonging, rather than aiming for diversity. And, you know, like that can kind of spend a lot of money and energy with very little actual results.
Right. Or something that looks like results, but is not felt.
Yeah, well, not long-term results, right?
Yeah.
They tend to be short-term when you kind of go the diversity route.
Yeah.
You get a lot of turnover and stuff like that. So we really like to start with accessibility and say, who can even get here?
Yeah.
You know, like, it doesn't matter how fairly you're treating or how inclusive you are if they can't even be
They're
here.
not, right.
And then move to equity and inclusion, and then kind of see the fruits of diversity and belonging as a consequence.
So that's really helpful. In fact, if I could sort of lift that and put it right at the beginning here, I would, because I think sort of defining this was the first thing I had to do to educate myself. I run a business, and we talk about this often in that context as well. But you've seen this play out in all sorts of ways. When you are working with a client who has said, increasing accessibility and equity in my organization is important to me, help me do that. What do you, I talk about sort of what's inside the four corners. What do you put in that bucket? And are they usually as surprised as I was to learn sort of how this works?
So they usually, like, anybody who says that, we're like, okay, now you're woke, because you're evolved to saying I want to start with equity and inclusion is like a huge
Like a signal.
Yeah, it's a signal that
You mean as
that they've
opposed to
done their
starting
homework.
with
diversity.
We have diversity problem. I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Most people are coming to us and saying diversity as like their number one issue. And we're like, interesting. Okay. That tells us a lot. And there's a lot of ways I can go down this path, I guess, but I'll say a few things. And then again, Radha, please keep me honest here and add. But the first thing is that folks often start with like their biggest pain point, and most recently it has been talent, right? It has been like if you Google search anything about the Great Resignation right now, you'll be like, oh, like you'll get a ton of pages and pages.
My
of
last
results.
podcast would show up.
Okay, see, and I argue that that's not necessarily true. I don't know that people are like resignating in droves and hundreds of thousands. I mean, I think that what's true is that people are sick of the system. And so I want to actually talk about something that's really important in the context of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. We hear it a lot related to racism and inequities, but there are sort of 4 or 5 levels of this, right? There's the intrapersonal racism that we talk about. There's interpersonal between you and I. There is cultural stuff that can show up. There is the institutional, meaning like at a company, you're going to experience inequities or racism. And then there's systemic issues. And where I frankly feel that the people of the world, or the United States specifically, because that's where we're located, the conversation has been focused a lot on interpersonal racism, interpersonal inequities, and this fighting that we have, or this sort of tribalism that exists, which is absolutely true. I mean, to just reduce it to that, though, is the problem, because what is actually at play here is systemic issues that have been created by this ecosystem that we find ourselves in. And it's not just unique to the United States. This is a global thing. And I believe that if we went and colonize Mars, it would follow us there. Why? Because we are unique and complex and adaptive systems ourselves as people. And so wherever we go, our problems follow. But we find ourselves like in a system. And so I say that to not talk about that and to not address that is, I feel like, our biggest disservice, and part of the reason why you sometimes have CEOs and venture capitalists not understanding, like literally being like perplexed as to why they're like, I paid such and such. I gave you all a budget to fix this. And they're like, what's wrong? And we're like, you know why? Because you all play in a system called capitalism, literally. Okay. And that system, let's talk about the elephant in the room, that the system itself, the way it was designed and has been operated and has effectively been run for hundreds of years, is to be extractive, is to not put people first. Okay. And so if we're in a system that does not put people first, it feels really weird to be like, tell me about your identities, tell me about your unique intersectionalities. And like, because the system doesn't reward for that. We actually have to put people last in the system that we're playing in. And so I feel that that's where we are. That is the truth. I want to kind of ground us in that reality, and to demonstrate and to the listeners that this is much more than a micro issue, and it's a macro issue at the same time. There's lots of things at play. And because of that,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, because, we are likely not going to dismantle capitalism, but if we want the world to be better, more equitable, and we want our work spaces and environments to be more inclusive, how do we solve for that, right? How do we solve for that? How do we, without dismantling the system, how do we improve things?
Well, we do want to dismantle the system. Let me just say that we do. we and I do think that's unique to what we do. Like literally, we dream of the future, and that's part of our actual consultancy, is dreaming the future. And I think to do that, you can still live in a house and build a new one. There's nothing wrong with that. You see people right now building the metaverse. Well, there's an opportunity there as well. And I think in the age of digital health, They're building digital healthcare, facilities and experiences. And so this is an opportunity for us to sort of transition the conversation into what we do best. But like I said, people are thinking about it from this, interpersonal issue that exists, which is like, let's talk about unconscious bias and let's talk about racism. And I'm like, yes, we can do that, but it doesn't really do us the greatest service if we're not going to also acknowledge the fact that there's systemic issues at play. And so, Radha, if you wouldn't mind, talking about some of that, because I know I want to do it in the spirit of time, to transition us there.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is that like a really big piece of doing this work is not just change management, but change leadership, right? And transformation, right? And I hear you, Rebecca, sort of saying like, well, that if it's outside of my scope, how can I take action on it, right? Like I personally am not the agent of change for the system of capitalism. And I think that what we're saying is, but maybe you are, right? And that like the two really important pieces of how we think about this change. One is that it's really, really important. This like idea that I hear Chanté sort of teasing out for us here, that is like, think global, act local, right? Where it's really important to hold this North Star vision of what is that dream of the future and to be firmly rooted in where we are right now. And that every day we have thousands of decisions that we make that can either be pointed in the way that it traditionally has been, which is away from equity, right? And away from justice, because the default is toward supremacy culture, right? So we have 1,000 decisions every day as individuals and in our organizations and in our communities and the spheres of influence that we move through to make those decisions point toward that North Star, right? Each of us has those. And that's where that intrapersonal, right? Because we're both simultaneously saying you have to zoom out to the system and be aware of the air we're breathing. And you have to be deeply rooted in self-awareness before you even start thinking about your interpersonal pieces, intrapersonal. And so that's piece number one. And I think the other piece that I want to name really quick about that, and this one's a quickie for the change management piece, is both having that aspiration and dream for what's possible while you're loving where we are, right? That it's not that this is broken and that this is bad and we need to reject it, but that we need to like notice what's working here, what's really, really good about what we've built, and how do we leverage and like build on that and do that asset-based approach to say like, I don't want to talk about fixing deficits. I want to talk about building possibility, right? And taking assets and resources and saying, how do I channel this into something that I dream of?
So I love this framing because I think it actually is very, it is a very like what my clients are dealing with day to day, which is trying to be firmly rooted in a healthcare system that's complex and in many ways broken and siloed and overregulated, some would say, and sort of having their businesses be firmly rooted in that, the now, the real, the current, and still be able to see over here the possibility, right? Where things could be if the right now looked a little different, right? How we could be better, do better, serve better, if the world didn't look like it looked today. And I think like it's probably why you all have been successful, that framing probably resonates with folks like that.
I think that's right. And I would go so far as to say, and I'm not making this up, right? I'm not sure who said this first, but like the system is not broken. It is designed to work exactly how it's working. And those design constraints that we brought in, in the very beginning of healthcare's inception in this country, were oriented toward objectives that made a lot of sense at the time and were solving some really important problems and created other ones around inequity and supremacy and stuff like that. And so it's actually, and I think that's actually a really important distinction, because that which has been designed can be redesigned, right? And that there is always this opportunity to be revisiting and like naming those constraints and naming those design objectives and naming what success looks like, and then rebuilding. Right. And, we rebuild the wall or rebuild the house like brick by brick, right? We're moving it from this place to this place. We're eating the elephant one bite at a time. Like, again, choose whatever metaphor and analogy feels good. But that's the only way that we're going to get anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I believe that wholeheartedly. Absolutely. Okay. So we don't start with hiring, diverse candidates. That's not our first step. I'm a company that believes in this. These are my values. I know this is good for business, and I know it's the right thing, and I know it's what my people want. Where do I start?
We feel like culture is a really great place to start, because it can address so many of the things that people ideally want to come to you for, which is, yes, it actually, if you address the culture, it requires you to start to take an examination of like what's in the room and who is not in the room. And so you will get to the identities pieces and diversity, as an outcome or as a consequence. And when you truly kind of address the culture, you may also start to hear the people who work for you and or your customers or the constituents in which you serve start to tell you the realities in which they're finding themselves in. And so culture can be internally and it can be externally to that organization. And so we that is one thing that we feel like we're in the business of, right? It's helping people design inclusive, equitable, and accessible cultures, but we also help them design product, services, and offerings that match that culture.
Yeah, it's surfacing for me a bunch of cringy moments that we all witnessed last year when companies started with their external culture before they addressed their internal culture and forgot that their internal people were going to be seeing it. So I would assume and confirm for me that, to Radha's point, looking inward first is probably the place to start.
It is. And it is like as a person as well. It is like actually as a leader as well. It's really important to start with yourself. But, it's interesting because in the context of healthcare specifically, the reason why we find that this is so important and it's worth spending a few minutes on is that we did specifically notice healthcare companies, putting out statements and saying that they were going to be down for the cause in relation to George Floyd being murdered and Breonna Taylor being murdered, Ahmaud Arbery. They were outraged and they were like, we're going to do something about it. And we saw all this movement and like awesome, activism in terms of being stated from healthcare organizations. And we were like, yes, but you know what? Where we found the disconnect was that they went to the communities and the patients first. And I'm like, has anybody forgotten that if you're a healthcare organization and likely like a health system, you're likely the biggest employer in town. That's a fact.
Right.
And that your patients and your community members and your employer and your employees are inextricably linked. They are the same. Like if you can't do anything for the community if you're not taking care of your employees, because your employees live in the community and they're going to talk about their experience. And if you're doing everything right, they're going to come to your healthcare system. And if they're not coming to your healthcare system, that tells you a lot about the services that you're doing, or that you're not actually, meeting people where they are. And this is the experience of a lot of healthcare workers, especially allied healthcare workers. My mom is an allied healthcare worker. She can't get time off from work to go to the doctor. My mom is an allied healthcare worker and has a lot of issues with, accessibility to care. It's not because she is not educated and doesn't have a daughter that went to nursing school. It's not because she doesn't have a car or, transportation. There's a lot of other things about her unique lived experience that make it impossible for her to get to her doctor's appointment. That's, helps her be a healthier patient and a healthier employee that the health system is carrying on their insurance. So it's for everybody's benefit that she gets to do this, but they don't have the time because of the system that we're in healthcare to stop and make that a reality right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that like one of the things that we're kind of pointing to that people, this question of values comes up a lot. And I think that when people are doing these signals, they're saying we're making statements, we're, taking action, albeit, maybe not necessarily always the most informed action. One of the things that folks talk about is, what are our core values? And core values are super, super valuable if you live by them, right? If at every level, from the very top to the most junior, and every level of detail, most strategic to the most tactical, that we're holding those true. And we're saying, okay, is this meeting agenda consistent with these values that we've stated? And one of the things that's tricky is that we don't typically put in our value statements that one of the most important values is keeping this business alive and being able to financially sustain everyone who works here. And that is also a very important value. And we can't pretend like it's not a part of this landscape. And so the practice, not only of always grounding back in those values, but going far enough to acknowledge and hold when our values are at odds, right? When there's tension between those values, because it is always the case that there are tension, that values compete. Yeah. And that complexity is part of the lived human experience. And if we pretend that it's not true and we bypass that, then we end up defaulting most often to traditional systems that reinforced inequity and supremacy and things like that. And so we really, really urge folks to hold those values dear, including the part where you can't hold them dear because there's something else you have to do. And saying that out loud and saying, okay, in this instance, I'm valuing blank even over blank.
Right. Yeah, I read I'm reading a book right now called What It Takes, and I'm going to forget the author right now, but it's a book about sort of the world's top companies, all of them, in this capitalistic system. But one of them was a story about a company that had this values tension. And the old CEO said, customers first always. And the new CEO coming in, the next generation, sort of said, well, okay, but I think our people are also quite important, right? And it was a massive fight that happened within this company about their sort of core values. And it was the first time that I had sort of thought about this concept that you're gonna make these trade-offs. Your values are going to show themselves to you. Saying them out loud and using them as tools to make decisions that are in line with them is absolutely the only way that you get people to trust you, basically.
Totally. Yeah. And it's that it has been the topic of so many specific conversations that we've had with our clients, is exactly that specific tension. And I think the one other thing that I would throw in also that is one of these aspirational, please do this things, is decentralize, right? And distribute. And by that, I mean voice and choice at every level of every person, every population, every stakeholder. And one of the things that we at the Darkest Horse do is we talk a lot about the distinction between designing for and designing with. And again, we use design as a very expansive term, right? Of any kind of decision or idea or solution or whatever. And that designing for is how a lot of companies operate, right? And it tends to be primarily white, able-bodied, neurotypical folks designing for as many people as they think they can extract wealth from. And they design white solutions, right? White, able-bodied, cisgendered solutions. And then just assume that if they give it to people that everybody's going to like it. And that is a very top down. That's very I am the expert. It's a very kind of, again, supremacy sort of posture. Whereas you can shift. How do you shift decision making? How do you shift input? How do you shift this so that we can be designing with and getting participatory design? And in an organization, that means voices, right? That decisions are not just made by the 1, 3, 12 people who are earning the most and have the most education and stuff like that, but are actually being informed and made more decentralized and more distributed.
Yeah, and I think the benefits are probably more than twofold, but the two big ones that I've learned in my career are, one, unfortunately, the boss doesn't always have the best ideas, right? In most cases, more ideas create a better outcome. And the second big benefit is everybody wants to make their contribution to the world meaningful. We all spend our time working. We all want to contribute, and we all want to have a say in, how the product that our company makes, or the processes that we go through, or I don't know, the color of the walls in the conference room, whatever it is. And ultimately, as a business owner, I want that for the folks that work with and for me, that they get the same kind of satisfaction out of us building this company as I do. So, okay, so we're coming to the end of our time. I have more questions than I started the day with.
Perfect.
But
we told you this would take all day.
Well, I know the two of you personally, so I'll just keep bothering you for private conversations.
Please. Yes, please.
And so thank you so much for joining. And I'll have all of your information in the show notes if anybody else wants to, pick your brains and or follow you or listen to your podcast. But I wanted to close with maybe one from each of you. One thing that sort of digital health innovators can do right now, today, to supercharge their success as it relates to this conversation.
One thing? That's hard. I'm kidding. I think that, I guess I'm going to say two things. It starts with self-awareness, like literally, just doing your best to take an inventory, take notice of who you are, like how we started the conversation with our unique identities. Get in the habit of trying to understand who you are, and like embrace it and celebrate who you are. And I want to say that a lot of times people will say, like, I'm white, and is it bad? And I'm like, no, that is good. You should recognize and be able to say it comfortably that you are in a white body, and that you do see the world through your white gaze, but that to acknowledge it is really important, because that means that you have humility. And that also means that perhaps you recognize that that's not the only view in the world. So self-awareness is really important. And then once you get that and you feel comfortable with who you are, to recognize, to say, like, let me go find others. And by others, I literally do mean to find people who are intentionally different than you, because I feel like the closer you can get to them in proximity and in community actually does, expand your worldview. And if you're going to be working in healthcare, that is absolutely needed for the future of this industry.
It's the work.
Yeah. I'm going to yes, I agree with Chanté's. I think I would even bump up the community piece one level and say that that doing this well means both being in community with people who share your identities, and being where you can be really honest and messy about what it's like to be moving through the world with this body, right? And because I think that those spaces, those sacred spaces, are actually really, really important spaces for healing and honesty, that you can be a little bit safe from doing harm to people who are different from you. And this is especially from a white perspective, right? Being in community with other white people where we can talk about our whiteness without the harm, the impact on Black bodies by even having that conversation. Yes, community, 100% agree. And I think I would also say I have a rule of thumb of listening 10 times to the voices, the experts on something before I speak. So before I try and say anything about what trans inclusive services will look like, I have been quiet and listened to at least 10 trans identifying folks explain to me what they think. And so I can like try and synthesize and make sure that like I'm not speaking for someone, but I am lifting up the voices, right? And like reiterating and echoing.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's like, have you listened to a lot of people who represent the identities that you're noticing are underrepresented in whatever population you're looking at, right? So again, if you're looking at this diversity question, you're like, wow, we have no Black consumers. How many Black folks who hold the identities that you know, or hold the various demographics and stuff that you wish to invite in, how many of those folks have you specifically, personally listened to, right? How much contact, and this is like what Chanté is saying of being in community, but I actually specifically mean don't just be in community, be a like servant leader, right? Be humble, be listening, be a passenger, be not decenter yourself before you then move into trying to build that bridge.
I'm ingesting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have lots to chew on. Really appreciate your time today. And anybody who's listening, go ahead and give us a follow. Listen to the Darkest Horse podcast. Go check out what Rada and Chanté are doing. It's truly radically wonderful. And have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.